Berlin, 1907. A city humming with confidence. Electric lights were beginning to replace gas lamps, laboratories glowed late into the night, and doctors spoke with the assurance of men who believed the human body had finally surrendered its secrets. Disease was being named, categorized, pinned down like insects in glass cases. Bones, especially, were considered honest things. They grew when they were supposed to grow, hardened when they were supposed to harden, and once formed, they stayed the way nature intended. Bones did not improvise. They did not rethink themselves. They did not change their minds. And yet, in one hospital ward, behind heavy doors and hushed conversations, there was a child whose body refused to follow the rules. The records never open with drama. No grand language. No alarmist claims. Just measurements, observations, dates. But between those lines sits something profoundly disturbing. A young patient whose skeleton did not behave like a skeleton. A child whose bones appeared to alter their structure over time, thickening where they should thin, softening where they should strengthen, reshaping themselves in ways no textbook could explain. Not a single sudden transformation, but a slow, relentless rewriting, as if the body itself were unsure what shape it wanted to be. At first, no one noticed. There was no monstrous deformity at birth, no immediate horror. The child entered the world quietly, like any other, wrapped in cloth and expectation. Early notes describe nothing remarkable. Normal limbs. Normal weight. A body that fit neatly into the rigid confidence of early 20th century medicine. If there was something wrong, it hid itself well. But medicine thrives on patterns, and what came next did not follow one. A limp that should have healed did not. A bone that should have grown straight did not. Pain arrived without injury. Stiffness without cause. When doctors examined the child, they found contradictions. Bones that felt denser than expected in some places, alarmingly fragile in others. Measurements taken months apart did not match. X-ray plates, still a relatively new miracle at the time, showed shapes that seemed subtly, disturbingly different from earlier images. Not dramatic enough to be dismissed as error. Not consistent enough to be explained. At first, the assumption was simple: mistake. A misreading. A faulty image. After all, science did not fail, people did. Instruments did. Human eyes did. The child was re-examined. Measured again. Observed again. And again. Each time, the body betrayed expectation. What frightened the doctors was not just that the bones were abnormal. Medicine had long catalogued deformities. What unsettled them was movement. Not physical movement, but biological change. The skeleton was not frozen in its wrongness. It was active, adaptive, unpredictable, as if the rules governing bone growth were being rewritten in real time, inside a living human being. There is a particular kind of fear that emerges when expertise collapses. Not panic, not hysteria, but quiet dread. The kind that lives in marginal notes and unanswered questions. The kind that forces trained men to lower their voices when discussing a case. This child produced that fear. Because if bones could do this, if they could alter themselves without injury, disease, or clear cause, then what else about the human body was misunderstood? Berlin was the wrong place for this to happen. Or perhaps the only place it could. The city was a center of anatomical study, pathology, and medical authority. Its hospitals were filled with men who believed biology was mechanical, predictable, ultimately conquerable. Anomalies existed, yes, but only as rare exceptions that proved the rule. This child was not an exception. This child was a challenge. Doctors disagreed almost immediately. Some believed the case represented an unknown variation of an existing disease. Others argued it was a developmental disorder that simply hadn't progressed far enough to reveal itself fully. A few whispered about measurement error or exaggeration. One thing they all shared was discomfort. The kind that comes when certainty begins to rot from the inside. Meanwhile, the child remained. Growing older. Growing weaker. Being observed, measured, discussed. A living question mark. There is something deeply unsettling about a body that refuses to stabilize. Humans find comfort in trajectories, recovery or decline, growth or decay. This child followed none of them. Symptoms appeared, receded, returned altered. Bones that once seemed fragile hardened unnaturally. Others softened as if time itself were flowing backward through the skeleton. Medical notes struggled to keep up, filled with crossed-out conclusions and cautious language. And through it all, the most disturbing fact remained: this was happening slowly enough to be witnessed. This was not a sudden catastrophe that could be blamed on trauma or infection. It was not a single mutation frozen in place. It was a process. A quiet, ongoing biological rebellion. By the time whispers of the case reached beyond the immediate ward, the tone had shifted. This was no longer just an unusual patient. It was a problem. A problem without a solution, sitting uncomfortably inside a system built on answers. The child's body had become a living contradiction, proof that something fundamental was missing from medical understanding. And perhaps most disturbing of all was the implication no one wanted to say out loud. If science could not explain this child, then science itself was incomplete. The case files do not record fear. They record data. But fear leaks through the margins. In the careful phrasing. In the refusal to commit to conclusions. In the quiet decision to keep the case contained, discussed among specialists rather than broadcast as a triumph of discovery. This was not a story medicine wanted to tell the world, because it suggested that the human body was still capable of surprises, that beneath all the charts and classifications, there were processes unfolding beyond observation, beyond prediction, beyond control. In 1907, Berlin believed it stood at the edge of medical mastery. But somewhere within its most advanced institutions, a child lay whose bones told a different story. A story of instability, of uncertainty, of biology behaving in ways no one had prepared for. And that story was only just beginning. Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century was a city intoxicated by progress. Everywhere, there was motion, trams rattling over cobblestones, factories breathing smoke into the sky, lecture halls filling with young men convinced they were standing at the threshold of total human understanding. Science was no longer a quiet, philosophical pursuit. It was aggressive, confident, and public. Newspapers celebrated breakthroughs. Physicians were treated with reverence. The human body, once shrouded in superstition and fear, was increasingly spoken of as a machine, complex, yes, but ultimately decipherable. Medicine, in particular, was undergoing a transformation that bordered on arrogance. Germ theory had rewritten the understanding of disease. Surgery was becoming safer, anesthesia more reliable. Pathology institutes expanded, filled with preserved organs and meticulously labeled bones. Anatomy was no longer guesswork. It was measurement, classification, order. Students were taught that if something appeared strange, it was only because it had not yet been properly categorized. Berlin stood at the center of this belief. Its hospitals were among the most advanced in Europe. Its doctors corresponded with colleagues in Paris, Vienna, and London, sharing findings and debating classifications. New technologies, X-rays most notably, gave the impression that the body could finally be seen, truly seen, from the inside. Flesh could be penetrated by light. Bones could be captured on glass plates, frozen into clarity. What had once been hidden was now illuminated. But illumination can be deceptive. The early X-ray images of the era were crude by modern standards, ghostly impressions of skeletons hovering inside human outlines. Still, they inspired enormous confidence. Bones were suddenly visible without cutting the body open. Growth could be tracked. Deformities could be documented. Doctors believed that skeletal disorders, in particular, were becoming one of the most reliable areas of diagnosis. Bones, after all, were thought to be stable structures. They recorded a life's history faithfully: injuries, malnutrition, disease, all etched into calcium and collagen. That belief shaped everything. Medical education taught that bone development followed predictable stages. Childhood growth obeyed strict timelines. Deviation suggested known conditions: rickets, tuberculosis of the bone, congenital deformities. There was comfort in this predictability. It meant that even suffering could be named, charted, and anticipated. Culturally, Germany valued order and precision, and medicine reflected that mindset. Classification systems multiplied. Diseases were subdivided into ever more specific categories. The idea that something might exist outside those categories was not impossible, but it was deeply uncomfortable. An anomaly was acceptable only if it could eventually be absorbed into a framework. This was also an era when the authority of the physician was rarely questioned. Patients, especially children and the poor, were expected to submit to examination without protest. Hospitals were places of both care and observation. To be admitted was to become a subject of study, whether one consented or not. Ethical standards, as they would later be understood, were still embryonic. The pursuit of knowledge often outweighed individual experience. At the same time, there was an undercurrent of anxiety beneath the optimism. Medicine knew more than it ever had, but it also knew enough to sense how much remained unexplained. Genetics, as a field, was barely forming. Hormones were poorly understood. Metabolism was a black box of assumptions. The body was mapped, but not fully interpreted. Bones, however, were supposed to be simple. That assumption made them dangerous. Because when something fails in a system believed to be complete, the failure threatens the entire structure. If bones could behave unpredictably, if they could alter themselves without clear cause, then the foundational belief in biological order began to crack. Berlin's medical institutions were acutely sensitive to this. Reputation mattered. German medicine was held up as a model of rigor and authority. A case that resisted explanation was not just puzzling, it was potentially embarrassing. It raised the possibility that confidence had outrun understanding. This is why strange cases were often handled quietly, discussed in closed meetings, circulated in cautious academic language, recorded in files that few would ever read. Not because doctors were cruel or dismissive, but because uncertainty was dangerous. It invited doubt. It suggested that mastery was an illusion. And yet, the city was also a magnet for anomalies. People traveled to Berlin seeking answers. Its hospitals drew patients with rare conditions, desperate for diagnosis. Children with deformities, adults with unexplained pain, bodies that did not fit expectations, all were brought into these institutions in the hope that modern science could finally explain what older traditions could not. In this environment, a child whose bones did not behave correctly was not just another patient. It was a stress test. The medical culture of the time favored linear explanations. Cause led to effect. Disease followed progression. Treatment followed diagnosis. This case refused to move in straight lines. Symptoms contradicted timelines. Observations conflicted with earlier observations. The body seemed to revise itself, undermining the idea that growth was a one-way process. Such contradictions created a peculiar tension. Doctors trusted their instruments, but instruments could not interpret meaning. Measurements could be taken, images produced, samples examined, but interpretation still relied on theory. And theory lagged behind reality. There was also the broader social context to consider. Germany in 1907 was grappling with ideas about heredity, degeneration, and biological destiny. Bodies were increasingly viewed through the lens of national strength and weakness. Abnormality carried stigma. A child whose body defied classification unsettled not just medicine, but ideology. Was this a flaw? A warning? An exception that could be ignored? Or something else entirely? Berlin's confidence in science rested on the belief that time would resolve all mysteries. If something could not be explained today, it would be explained tomorrow. Progress was inevitable. Knowledge marched forward. The unanswered question was merely a temporary inconvenience. But some cases did not age well. Some remained unresolved not because effort was lacking, but because the conceptual tools did not exist. Without genetics, without molecular biology, without an understanding of cellular signaling, certain phenomena could only be described, not explained. Doctors could observe the outcome, but not the mechanism. And this created a quiet discomfort. A recognition, however reluctant, that the body was not merely a machine assembled from predictable parts, that it possessed internal processes capable of behaving in ways that felt almost intentional, almost creative. In Berlin's hospitals, surrounded by charts and calipers and confident lectures, this realization hovered unspoken. Medicine stood at a crossroads between observation and comprehension, between mastery and humility. The child whose case would soon trouble these institutions arrived at precisely that moment. Not in an age of ignorance, but in an age of overconfidence. Not when medicine knew too little, but when it believed it knew enough. That is what made the case so disturbing. Because if this could happen here, at the heart of modern science, then it could happen anywhere. And if it could happen once, then the human body still held secrets that no amount of light, no matter how penetrating, could fully expose. Before the doctors noticed anything unusual, before the measurements and the debates, before the case acquired its quiet reputation, there was simply a child. A birth recorded in careful handwriting, a weight noted, a length measured, A brief confirmation that everything appeared as it should. No warnings in the margins. No urgent symbols. Just another life entering a city that believed it understood how bodies worked. The family was unremarkable by design. They did not belong to Berlin's elite medical circles, nor were they completely destitute. Ordinary people, living ordinary routines, trusting that health was something inherited by default unless proven otherwise. In the early months, nothing disturbed that belief. The child fed well, cried as expected, moved arms and legs with the restless energy of infancy. There was no immediate reason to fear the future. Early development followed a familiar rhythm. The first attempts at sitting, the unsteady movements that signaled growing strength, the gradual discovery of balance. These milestones reassured the parents, reinforcing the sense that whatever uncertainties life held, the body itself was reliable. Doctors of the time believed strongly in visible signs. If something was wrong, it would announce itself clearly. Hidden disorders were thought to be rare, almost theoretical. But subtlety is often where the most unsettling stories begin. The first concerns were easy to dismiss. A complaint of pain after a fall that should have healed quickly. A reluctance to put weight on a limb that showed no obvious injury. Children were fragile, doctors said. Bones bent. Muscles strained. Nothing in the child's appearance suggested anything more than temporary discomfort. The family was advised to wait. Waiting became a pattern. Small inconsistencies accumulated. Movements that seemed stiff one week and fluid the next. Swelling that appeared and vanished without explanation. The child learned to compensate instinctively, favoring certain postures, avoiding others. It was not dramatic. There were no screams of agony, no grotesque distortions. Just an unease that settled quietly into daily life. What troubled the parents most was not pain, but unpredictability. Good days followed bad ones without logic. A limp would fade, only to return altered. The body seemed to adjust itself, as though responding to forces no one else could see. When they finally sought medical advice, they did so not in panic, but confusion. The first examinations offered reassurance. Children grew unevenly, doctors explained. Bones developed at different rates. Minor abnormalities often corrected themselves with time. The language of medicine was calm, almost comforting. Growth, they insisted, would smooth out the irregularities. For a while, it seemed plausible. Then the child began to change in ways that could not be explained away. Not suddenly, not violently, but persistently. Limbs that had appeared straight developed subtle curves. Joints stiffened, then loosened. Pain became more frequent, though still inconsistent. The body resisted prediction. Each attempt to describe what was happening was undermined by the next observation. As months passed, the difference between the child and others became harder to ignore. Play became cautious. Movement was deliberate. Falls that should have resulted in bruises led to fractures, while more serious impacts sometimes left no trace at all. The body's responses did not match expectation. Emotionally, the child adapted in ways that went largely unnoticed by the adults around them. Children learn quickly when their bodies cannot be trusted. They become careful, watchful. They learn the limits of their own movement through trial and quiet error. The absence of a clear diagnosis meant there was no language to explain these limitations, only behavior shaped by instinct. By the time the child was referred to specialists, something had shifted. The family no longer sought reassurance. They sought answers. Medical attention intensified. Examinations became longer, more invasive. The child's body was measured, pressed, observed. Doctors spoke to one another in technical terms, occasionally forgetting the presence of the small figure on the examination table. For the first time, the child sensed that their body was no longer just theirs. It had become something of interest. Hospital visits grew more frequent. Each one carried a quiet hope that this time, someone would finally explain what was wrong. Each ended with uncertainty. Diagnoses were suggested and retracted. Treatments were proposed cautiously, then abandoned. The child's condition did not follow the expected course of improvement or deterioration. What unsettled the physicians most was the timeline. Bone disorders, as they understood them, progressed in specific ways. They worsened steadily or stabilized. They did not revise themselves. They did not partially heal in one area while deteriorating in another without cause. The family began to sense that something deeper was wrong, even if no one would say it directly. Doctors spoke less decisively. Appointments took longer. Notes grew denser. Conversations shifted from the child's experience to the child's skeleton. Despite this, life outside the hospital continued. The family returned home after each visit, carrying uncertainty with them. The child attended school intermittently. Social interactions became strained. Physical differences, however subtle, invite attention. Questions from other children became harder to answer. The child learned to deflect, to minimize, to hide pain when possible. At night, discomfort intensified. Bones ached without clear reason. Positions that once brought relief no longer worked. The body seemed restless, unsettled from within. Sleep became fragmented. Fatigue accumulated. Yet even then, there were mornings when the child woke feeling almost normal, as if the previous suffering had been a mistake. This fluctuation deepened the confusion. Improvement should have meant recovery. Decline should have meant disease. The alternation between the two defied both interpretations. When imaging studies were performed, the results unsettled everyone involved. X-rays revealed bones that did not match earlier images. Not dramatically, not grotesquely, but enough to provoke silence. Doctors compared plates side by side, searching for explanation. Growth patterns appeared inconsistent. Density varied in ways that could not be accounted for by nutrition or injury alone. The child watched these examinations without understanding their significance, sensing only the shift in atmosphere. Adults who once spoke confidently now hesitated. Faces tightened. Voices lowered. Something had changed, and even without words, the child felt it. By this point, the case had begun to drift beyond routine care. Specialists were consulted. Opinions multiplied. The family was drawn into a world of medical language that offered complexity but little clarity. Each new explanation carried hope, and each eventual rejection deepened despair. What was perhaps most tragic was the absence of a narrative. Humans endure suffering more easily when it fits into a story, illness leading to treatment, injury leading to healing. This child's experience lacked that structure. There was no clear beginning, no identifiable enemy, no promised resolution. The body simply continued to behave strangely. And as the child grew older, the question became impossible to avoid. If this was not a known disease, then what was it? A mistake of nature? A rare variation? Or something medicine had not yet learned how to see? Unbeknownst to the family, the child was already becoming something else in the eyes of science. Not just a patient, but a problem. A living contradiction. A case that would challenge assumptions long after the child's own voice faded from the records. But for now, there was only the slow accumulation of evidence, the quiet erosion of normality, and a child whose body was beginning to drift away from every explanation offered to contain it. The first formal medical examination marked a shift from concern to unease. Until then, the child's condition had been discussed in fragments. Brief consultations, cautious suggestions, reassurances offered more out of habit than certainty. But when the child was admitted for closer evaluation, the tone changed. This was no longer a matter of waiting to see what would happen. Something was happening, and it demanded to be observed. The examination room itself was austere, designed for precision rather than comfort. Cold surfaces, metal instruments laid out in careful order, charts pinned neatly to the walls. The child was positioned, repositioned, asked to move, to bend, to resist pressure. Hands pressed along limbs, fingers tracing the contours of bone beneath skin. Doctors exchanged glances when something felt wrong, when density did not match expectation, when joints resisted movement in subtle, inconsistent ways. Measurements were taken meticulously. Length of limbs, circumference of joints, angles of curvature. These numbers were written down with care, compared against standard growth charts. At first glance, nothing appeared dramatically abnormal. The child was small, perhaps, but not alarmingly so. Proportions were close enough to pass casual inspection. It was only in comparison, in repetition, that the discrepancies began to emerge. X-rays were ordered. At the time, radiography was still imbued with a sense of wonder. To see inside the body without cutting it open felt almost miraculous. The child was positioned carefully as glass plates were exposed, the process slow and uncomfortable. When the images were developed, doctors gathered around them in silence. The skeleton that appeared on the plates was not grotesque. It did not scream deformity. That, perhaps, was what made it so unsettling. The bones looked almost normal, almost. Certain areas appeared denser than expected. Others showed irregularities in shape, subtle thickening where thinning should have occurred. Growth plates did not align cleanly with the child's age. At first, these findings were attributed to error. Radiographic distortion was common. Exposure times varied. The child's movement could have affected the image. New plates were taken. Angles adjusted. Results compared. The anomalies persisted. Doctors began to consult textbooks, tracing diagrams with their fingers, searching for a match. Known conditions were considered one by one. Rickets. Possibly, but the mineralization patterns did not align. Congenital deformity. Unlikely, given the child's earlier normal development. Trauma. There was no history that could account for such widespread irregularity. The most troubling aspect was not what the images showed, but what they suggested over time. When earlier measurements and plates were reviewed, subtle differences emerged. Bones that had appeared slightly curved now appeared straighter. Others that had seemed robust now looked oddly porous. These were not dramatic changes, but they were undeniable. The skeleton was not static. Follow-up examinations were scheduled sooner than usual. The child was brought back repeatedly, subjected to the same tests. Each visit added data, and each set of data contradicted the last in small but significant ways. Growth was not following a predictable path. It was adjusting, revising itself. Doctors began to document their observations with increasing caution. Language shifted. Words like appears and suggests replaced definitive statements. Uncertainty crept into the notes. Measurements were double-checked. Calculations repeated. The child's body resisted the clarity that medicine depended on. Physically, the examinations became more difficult for the child. Bones were tender. Joints protested manipulation. The process of being examined, prodded, positioned, immobilized, became a source of distress. Yet the child endured, sensing the seriousness without fully understanding it. Emotionally, the atmosphere in the examination room grew heavier. Conversations among physicians were no longer casual. They spoke in lowered voices, often stepping away from the child to confer. There was no overt panic, but there was tension. Something about this case was slipping beyond routine. One particularly unsettling discovery emerged during comparative imaging. A bone that had previously shown signs of fragility now appeared denser, almost reinforced. Another showed the opposite progression. It was as if different parts of the skeleton were operating under different rules, responding to internal signals no one could identify. This defied the prevailing understanding of bone physiology. Bones were thought to remodel slowly and uniformly, responding primarily to mechanical stress and nutrition. What was happening here did not fit that model. The changes were uneven, asynchronous, purposeful in a way that felt wrong. Speculation intensified. Some doctors suggested an unknown metabolic disorder. Others proposed endocrine involvement, though hormone science was still in its infancy. A few quietly questioned whether the child's age had been misrecorded, whether growth expectations were flawed. But no single explanation held. As the examinations continued, the child's condition worsened in subtle ways. Pain became more frequent. Fatigue set in. Movements grew more guarded. The body seemed to be working harder just to maintain itself. Yet even then, there were moments of apparent stability that confounded expectations. The medical team began to realize that they were not observing a static abnormality, but a process, a dynamic, ongoing transformation unfolding inside a living body. This realization was deeply unsettling. It suggested that whatever mechanism was at work was active, adaptive, and resistant to intervention. Attempts at treatment were tentative. Dietary adjustments, rest, mild physical supports. Nothing produced clear improvement. Worse, nothing produced predictable results. Interventions that should have helped sometimes coincided with deterioration, while periods of inaction sometimes preceded apparent stabilization. The child became, in effect, a living experiment without a hypothesis. By the end of this initial phase of examination, something unspoken had settled over the case. The doctors knew they were facing something beyond their current understanding. They continued to observe, to measure, to document, but with a growing sense that the tools they possessed were insufficient. For the family, the examination brought no relief. They left with more questions than answers, armed with technical explanations that explained nothing. The child, meanwhile, carried away the memory of cold instruments, serious faces, and a body that seemed increasingly foreign even to itself. What began as a routine medical evaluation had become the opening chapter of a mystery. A moment when science leaned forward, confident in its methods, only to discover that the body before it was playing by rules no one had written down. As weeks turned into months, the pattern that emerged was not one of simple decline, but of continual alteration. The child's body did not merely weaken or deform, it adjusted. Bones that once seemed fragile grew unnaturally dense, while others appeared to soften without warning. There was no symmetry to these changes, no clean progression from healthy to diseased. Instead, the skeleton behaved as though it were negotiating with itself, rewriting its own structure in response to forces no one could identify. Repeated examinations confirmed what many of the doctors had begun to fear. The child's bones were not just developing abnormally, they were changing over time in ways that contradicted everything known about skeletal biology. Measurements taken weeks apart did not align. Curvatures that had once concerned physicians appeared to lessen, while new irregularities emerged elsewhere. The body refused to settle into a stable form. What made this especially disturbing was the pace. Bone remodeling was known to occur, but slowly, gradually, following clear rules. Here, the changes were subtle but persistent, noticeable within months rather than years. Enough to be measured. Enough to be undeniable. Too slow to be dramatic, too fast to be ignored. Doctors began to track the skeleton obsessively. Every limb was documented. Every joint measured. X-ray plates were labeled and archived, arranged in chronological order in an attempt to impose narrative on chaos. Yet when these images were laid side by side, they told a story no one was prepared to read. Certain bones appeared layered, as though new material had been deposited over older structures without replacing them cleanly. Others showed signs of partial resorption, areas where density faded unexpectedly. Growth plates behaved inconsistently, closing early in some regions while remaining active in others. The skeleton no longer reflected the child's age in any coherent way. The term rewriting began to appear informally in discussions, not as a diagnosis, but as a metaphor. It captured the sense that the skeleton was not following a script, but revising it. Bones seemed to respond not just to physical stress, but to internal signals that operated beyond conscious control or medical understanding. The child felt these changes before they were visible. Pain migrated unpredictably. One day concentrated in a limb, the next dispersed throughout the body. Stiffness would give way to weakness, then return in altered form. Movements learned through habit became unreliable as the body structure shifted beneath them. Walking required constant adjustment, as if the ground itself were unstable. For physicians, the inconsistency was maddening. Each new examination challenged conclusions drawn from the last. Prognosis became impossible. There was no baseline against which to measure improvement or decline. The skeleton was a moving target. Attempts to intervene met with frustration. Immobilization, intended to protect fragile bones, sometimes coincided with increased stiffness or discomfort elsewhere. Physical therapy, meant to preserve mobility, occasionally preceded unexpected changes in bone density. It was unclear whether these outcomes were causal or coincidental, but the lack of clarity only deepened anxiety. One particularly troubling observation emerged when earlier radiographs were re-examined alongside newer ones. Bones did not simply grow or shrink, they changed character. Areas that once appeared healthy took on abnormal textures. Structural patterns shifted in ways that suggested internal reorganization rather than external damage. It was as if the skeleton were continuously remodeling itself without a clear endpoint. The doctors debated whether what they were seeing represented multiple overlapping conditions or a single, unknown process manifesting in complex ways. Some argued for a systemic disorder affecting bone metabolism. Others suspected a regulatory failure at the cellular level, though the language to describe such a failure barely existed at the time. What united these theories was their inadequacy. None could fully account for the breadth of observed changes. None could explain why the skeleton appeared to selectively reinforce certain areas while undermining others. None could predict what would happen next. The child, meanwhile, became increasingly aware that their body was unreliable. Simple actions carried risk. A misstep could result in injury, or nothing at all. There was no way to know. This unpredictability eroded confidence, fostering a cautiousness beyond the child's years. Play was abandoned. Movement became calculated. The body was treated not as an ally, but as something to be managed. Emotionally, the experience was isolating. Other children did not understand why rules seemed different. Adults offered reassurance they could not substantiate. The child learned quickly that pain was not always visible, and that describing it often led to confusion rather than comfort. From a medical perspective, the case grew increasingly uncomfortable. Each new observation undermined the belief that bones followed fixed laws. The skeleton appeared capable of adaptive behavior that bordered on autonomy. It was not just reacting to injury or deficiency, it was making changes that suggested internal decision-making, however unconscious. This raised unsettling questions. If bone tissue could behave in this way, what governed it? What signals told one region to harden while another weakened? And why did these signals operate so inconsistently? The idea that the body possessed internal regulatory systems beyond current understanding was not entirely new, but this case made the concept visceral. The child's skeleton was not merely malfunctioning, it was behaving creatively, improvisationally, in ways that defied reduction to simple pathology. Doctors began to speak of the case with a mixture of fascination and dread. Fascination, because it offered a glimpse into unknown biological territory. Dread, because it exposed the limits of their authority. Each unanswered question chipped away at the confidence that defined their profession. As time passed, the changes accelerated subtly. Not enough to be dramatic, but enough to be relentless. The skeleton seemed to be moving toward something, though no one could say what. There was no clear endpoint, no recognizable pattern. Just continuous transformation. The child's pain increased, though not uniformly. Some days were bearable. Others were not. Sleep was disrupted. Fatigue became constant. The body, in its effort to reorganize itself, exacted a toll. Medical notes grew thicker. Files expanded. The case acquired weight, not just physically, but symbolically. It was no longer simply about treating a child. It was about confronting a phenomenon that challenged fundamental assumptions about human biology. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the realization that observation itself offered no control. The doctors could watch the bones change. They could document every alteration. But they could not stop it. They could not guide it. They could not even understand it. The skeleton continued its quiet rebellion, rewriting itself beneath the skin, indifferent to the certainty of science and the suffering of the body it inhabited. As the case grew more complex, it began to move beyond the examination room and into the quieter, more guarded spaces of professional discussion. This was no longer a matter of one physician puzzling over unusual measurements. It became a subject of whispered consultation, of letters exchanged between colleagues, of careful phrasing in internal reports. The child's condition unsettled not only because it was rare, but because it resisted containment within existing knowledge. And when science encounters something it cannot contain, it often responds not with openness, but with caution. Behind closed doors, disagreements surfaced quickly. Some physicians argued that the case was being overinterpreted, that too much meaning was being drawn from minor variations. Measurement error, they insisted, could explain much of what appeared contradictory. Early radiography was imperfect. Human judgment was fallible. Better to assume flaws in observation than flaws in theory. This perspective offered comfort. It preserved the integrity of established knowledge. Others were less convinced. They pointed to the consistency of change over time, the repetition of anomalies across different instruments and observers. Too many variables aligned for coincidence. The skeleton was changing. Not randomly, but systematically enough to suggest an underlying process. This interpretation was far more troubling. Debates unfolded in staff meetings that never made it into official records. Voices rose, then softened. No one wanted to sound alarmist, but no one wanted to ignore what was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The language used was careful, almost defensive. Phrases like highly unusual and requiring further observation replaced more confident terminology. Certainty retreated into vagueness. What fueled the tension was not just scientific disagreement, but professional risk. Berlin's medical institutions thrived on authority. To acknowledge a case that undermined fundamental assumptions about bone development was to invite scrutiny. If bones could behave unpredictably, then how reliable were existing diagnostic frameworks? How many other cases had been misclassified, misunderstood, dismissed? There was also the fear of precedent. If this case were published widely, it would demand explanation. Questions would follow. Rival institutions might criticize Berlin's inability to provide answers. In an era where national pride and scientific prestige were deeply intertwined, uncertainty carried weight. As a result, the case was discussed selectively. Consultations were sought, but quietly. Specialists were invited to review the data under conditions of discretion. Opinions were gathered, but rarely recorded verbatim. The child became known not by name, but by reference number, a way to depersonalize and distance the problem. Some physicians approached the case with a sense of intellectual excitement. They saw in it the possibility of discovery, of contributing something genuinely new to medical science. But even they were restrained. Discovery without explanation was dangerous. To name a phenomenon without understanding it risked appearing reckless. Others reacted defensively. They insisted that no new biology was required, that existing models would eventually suffice if the data were interpreted correctly. These doctors favored conservative explanations, even when those explanations strained credibility. It was easier to believe that something was being misread than to accept that something fundamentally new was occurring. The most unsettling voices were the quietest. A few physicians acknowledged, privately, that the case exposed gaps in understanding that could not be bridged with current knowledge. They did not offer alternative theories. They simply admitted ignorance. This admission, though honest, carried its own discomfort. Medicine was not built to accommodate ignorance gracefully. As discussions continued, the child's case began to acquire a reputation. Not publicly, but within professional circles. A case that produced unease. A file that elicited sighs. Younger doctors were warned not to speculate too freely. Senior physicians cautioned restraint. The atmosphere surrounding the case grew tense, as if acknowledging its full implications might unleash something uncontrollable. Documentation reflected this anxiety. Reports became increasingly descriptive and less interpretive. Measurements were listed without commentary. Observations were recorded without conclusions. The case was being preserved, not solved. It was as though the medical community had collectively decided to pause, to wait for a future understanding that might one day arrive. This retreat into observation over interpretation was itself a form of panic, though a quiet one. It revealed the limits of a system built on confidence. When confronted with something that could not be explained, the system did not collapse. It narrowed. It protected itself by reducing engagement. Meanwhile, external pressures mounted. The child's family sought answers, pushing doctors for clarity. Each request intensified the internal strain. How much uncertainty could be shared? How much should be concealed? The ethics of disclosure were murky. To admit ignorance might undermine trust. To offer false certainty would be dishonest. Doctors walked this line carefully. Explanations were offered in broad, non-committal terms. Prognoses were vague. The family was reassured without being informed. This imbalance, between what doctors discussed privately and what they communicated publicly, reflected the discomfort at the heart of the case. The child's body had become a mirror, reflecting back the fragility of medical authority. Each unexplained change challenged not just a diagnosis, but a worldview. Science, which prided itself on elimination, found itself casting shadows instead. There were moments when the pressure nearly broke containment. A particularly striking radiograph. An unexpected shift in bone structure. Instances when consensus faltered completely. During these moments, the possibility of broader publication was raised, then quickly dismissed. More data was needed. More observation. Always more time. Time became a shield. The belief that answers would come eventually allowed the present discomfort to be deferred. If the case could not be explained now, it would be explained later. Progress, after all, was inevitable. But beneath this optimism lay an unspoken fear. What if progress was not fast enough? What if the explanation required concepts that did not yet exist? What if this case represented a phenomenon that would remain unresolved for decades? Such thoughts rarely made it into conversation, but they lingered nonetheless. They influenced decisions. They shaped caution. They encouraged silence. In the end, the scientific panic surrounding the case was not loud or chaotic. It was methodical, controlled. It manifested as restraint, as delay, as an insistence on observation over interpretation. It was the panic of a discipline encountering its own limitations and choosing, at least temporarily, to look away. The child remained at the center of this tension, their body continuing its quiet transformations while the machinery of medicine struggled to keep pace. And in the space between what was known and what could not be said, the case waited, unresolved, unsettling, and deeply uncomfortable. As the discussions continued behind closed doors, the consequences of uncertainty unfolded in a much more tangible way for the child and their family. Whatever scientific tension the case produced among physicians, it translated into something far simpler and far more brutal in daily life: pain without explanation, limits without reason, and a future that could not be described in any reassuring terms. The child's body had become a source of constant negotiation. Every movement required consideration. Standing too long brought aching that radiated through the limbs. Sitting in one position caused stiffness that lingered long after the body shifted again. Pain was not always sharp or dramatic. Often it was dull, persistent, wearing. The kind of discomfort that does not demand immediate attention but slowly erodes endurance. What made it worse was the inconsistency. There were days when movement felt almost normal, when the body seemed to cooperate, allowing brief illusions of recovery. These moments were dangerous in their own way. They encouraged hope. They suggested that perhaps the worst had passed. Then, without warning, the pain returned, altered, relocated, intensified. The body punished optimism. Sleep became fractured. Finding a position that did not strain some fragile or stiffened part of the skeleton grew increasingly difficult. Nights were interrupted by discomfort that could not be soothed with simple adjustments. Fatigue accumulated, dulling concentration, dampening mood, making even minor effort feel overwhelming. Emotionally, the child changed in ways that were subtle but profound. Where there had once been spontaneity, there was now caution. Where there had been confidence in movement, there was hesitation. The child learned to anticipate pain, to move defensively, to avoid activities that might provoke another unpredictable episode. Childhood shrank as the world became a series of risks to be managed. School, once a routine part of life, became complicated. Sitting for long periods was uncomfortable. Riding strained joints that no longer behaved predictably. Physical activities highlighted differences that were impossible to hide. Other children noticed. Questions were asked. Some were curious. Others were unkind. The child learned to explain as little as possible, because explanations only invited more confusion. Adults, too, struggled to respond appropriately. Teachers wanted to help but lacked guidance. Family members offered sympathy but could not provide answers. Every conversation circled the same unspoken question: what was happening, and what would happen next? The absence of a diagnosis created a peculiar isolation. Illness usually comes with a name, and names offer structure. They allow people to say, "This is what it is." Without one, the child's experience existed in a liminal space, acknowledged but not defined. Pain was real, but its cause was abstract. Suffering was visible, but its meaning was unclear. For the parents, this uncertainty was agonizing. They watched their child struggle without being able to frame that struggle within a narrative of treatment and recovery. Each medical visit raised hopes that were quietly dismantled by cautious language and noncommittal conclusions. They learned to listen for what was not said as much as for what was. Guilt crept in. Had something been missed earlier? Had they delayed too long before seeking help? Had some decision, some accident, set this process in motion? Without a clear cause, responsibility floated aimlessly, attaching itself to moments that might have been irrelevant. Financial strain added another layer of pressure. Frequent medical visits disrupted work. Specialized consultations carried costs. Travel, time away from normal routines, the cumulative burden of uncertainty, all of it weighed heavily. The family's life began to orbit the child's condition, everything else arranged around hospital appointments and recovery periods that never quite led to recovery. The child sensed this strain, even when it was not discussed openly. Children are acutely aware of shifts in adult behavior. They notice tension, exhaustion, quiet arguments held behind closed doors. The knowledge that their body was the source of this disruption added an emotional burden to the physical one. Guilt mingled with fear. Dependence felt like failure. At times, the child withdrew, choosing silence over complaint. Pain was endured quietly, not because it lessened, but because it seemed pointless to describe. Describing pain did not make it stop. It only produced worried looks and helpless gestures. Better to conserve energy. Medical examinations continued, but their emotional impact deepened. Each visit reinforced the idea that the child's body was an object of scrutiny rather than a source of agency. Being measured, photographed, discussed, it all contributed to a sense of distance from one's own physical self. The body became something external, something observed rather than inhabited. There were moments of resentment, though they were rarely expressed. Resentment toward a body that refused to behave. Toward doctors who spoke in careful language that offered no relief. Toward other children whose movements were effortless, whose bones did not betray them. These feelings were often accompanied by shame, quickly suppressed. The unpredictability of the condition made planning impossible. Promises were tentative. Events were approached with caution. The future narrowed into short intervals defined by the next appointment, the next examination, the next possible answer. Long-term thinking felt dangerous. Too much hope invited disappointment. What was perhaps most devastating was the erosion of trust in the body itself. The child learned that internal sensations could not be relied upon. Pain might signal danger, or it might not. Comfort might mean improvement, or it might precede decline. The body sent mixed messages, and learning how to interpret them became a constant, exhausting task. This uncertainty extended into identity. Who was the child becoming? Not simply someone who was ill, but someone whose illness could not be named. Someone defined not by a diagnosis, but by exception, by anomaly. This ambiguity shaped self-perception in ways that would linger long after the details of the case faded from memory. The family, too, existed in a state of suspension. They were neither confronting a known disease nor celebrating recovery. They lived in the space between, where vigilance replaced resolution. Every minor complaint was scrutinized. Every change prompted worry. Normal fluctuations in mood or energy were interpreted through the lens of the condition. Despite everything, there were moments of resilience. Laughter still surfaced, unexpected and defiant. Small victories, days with less pain, movements that felt easier, were cherished intensely. These moments did not erase suffering, but they provided brief reminders that life continued beyond the confines of the case file. Yet even these moments carried an undercurrent of fragility. They could be undone at any time. The body's capacity to surprise had become a source of fear as much as hope. In the end, the human cost of being unexplainable was not just physical suffering. It was the slow reshaping of a life around uncertainty. It was the psychological toll of existing without a framework, without language adequate to describe what was happening. It was the quiet exhaustion of enduring something that could not be named, predicted, or resolved. While doctors debated theories and preserved data for future understanding, the child lived the consequences of that gap in knowledge every day. The bones continued their silent transformations, and with each change, the distance between medical curiosity and human experience grew wider. As the child's condition progressed and the limits of observation became clear, the focus shifted toward explanation. If the bones could not yet be controlled, perhaps they could at least be named. Medicine has always relied on naming as a form of power. To assign a diagnosis is to impose structure on chaos, to suggest that suffering follows known rules. In this case, theory became the last refuge of certainty. The first explanations proposed were the most familiar. Rickets, long associated with poor nutrition and inadequate sunlight, was considered early on. The disease could cause bone softness, deformity, pain, and delayed growth. It was common enough to feel reassuring. But the evidence did not cooperate. The child's diet did not fit the pattern. Certain bones showed abnormal hardening rather than softening. And most critically, rickets followed a predictable course. Treated or untreated, it did not reverse itself in selective areas while worsening in others. The theory could explain fragments of the condition, but never the whole. Next came osteogenesis imperfecta, the so-called brittle bone disease. It offered an explanation for fractures and fragility, but it failed elsewhere. Children with this condition were typically fragile from birth, their bones consistently weak, not fluctuating between weakness and unnatural density. The child's early normal development and later irregular reinforcement of certain bones contradicted the diagnosis. It was another near miss. Congenital deformity was proposed by some physicians who believed the condition had been present all along, simply unnoticed. But this explanation collapsed under scrutiny. Early records showed no significant abnormalities. More importantly, congenital conditions did not evolve in this manner. They manifested early and remained relatively stable. They did not rewrite themselves. Infectious causes were explored as well. Bone tuberculosis was a known entity, capable of causing chronic pain and structural damage. But infections left signatures, patterns of destruction, inflammation, systemic illness. None of these were present. The child did not exhibit the fevers or general decline associated with such diseases. The skeleton showed remodeling, not erosion. Infection could not account for what was happening. Some physicians turned their attention to the endocrine system, though this was a field still shrouded in mystery. Hormones were poorly understood, their influence on growth only beginning to be recognized. Disorders of the thyroid or pituitary could affect bone development, but again, the pattern failed to align. Endocrine conditions tended to produce global effects, altering growth uniformly. This case was too selective, too uneven. Metabolic disorders were another possibility. The idea that the body might mishandle minerals, depositing or removing them improperly, held some appeal. But such disorders, where known, followed consistent trajectories. They did not produce the oscillation between strengthening and weakening seen here. And without the biochemical tools to test these hypotheses, speculation remained abstract. Environmental poisoning was raised quietly, almost reluctantly. Industrial Berlin exposed its inhabitants to a range of substances whose long-term effects were not fully understood. Could toxins interfere with bone development? Possibly. But the child's exposure history offered no clear culprit. And poisoning, like infection, tended to damage rather than reorganize. It destroyed. It did not remodel. Each theory failed in the same way. It explained one aspect while contradicting another. The bones were too fragile for some diagnoses, too dense for others, too dynamic for all of them. As explanations were proposed and discarded, a pattern emerged, not in the child's skeleton, but in medicine's response. Doctors clung to partial fits, reluctant to abandon familiar categories entirely. There was comfort in proximity. Even a flawed explanation felt safer than admitting that no explanation existed. Some suggested that multiple conditions might be at work simultaneously. Perhaps the child suffered from overlapping disorders, each contributing to a different aspect of the presentation. This approach allowed physicians to preserve existing frameworks by stacking them together. But it raised its own problems. The likelihood of such a combination was extraordinarily low, and it still did not account for the apparent coordination of skeletal changes. More unsettling ideas circulated quietly. Could this represent an entirely new disease? The suggestion was dangerous. New diseases demanded new language, new research, and often challenged established hierarchies. To propose such a thing without the ability to define or treat it risked professional isolation. A few physicians wondered whether the observed changes were not pathological at all, but regulatory, an internal system gone awry, directing bone growth and resorption in abnormal ways. This idea brushed against concepts that would later form the foundation of modern biology, but at the time, it lacked substance. Without a mechanism, it was philosophy rather than medicine. The deeper the inquiry went, the more the case exposed a central weakness in early 20th century science. Observation had outpaced understanding. Doctors could see what was happening, measure it, record it, but they could not explain how or why. The skeleton was behaving according to rules that had not yet been discovered. This gap bred frustration. Case conferences ended without resolution. Notes accumulated without synthesis. Theories multiplied, then stagnated. Each new idea generated brief excitement before collapsing under the weight of contradictory evidence. What troubled many physicians most was not that they could not explain the case, but that the case refused to remain consistent long enough to be pinned down. Just as one theory seemed plausible, the skeleton changed again, undermining it. The body was not waiting to be understood. It was continuing its own process, indifferent to interpretation. There was also the uncomfortable recognition that language itself was failing. Medical terminology was designed to describe static conditions or predictable progressions. It struggled to capture fluidity. Words like degeneration and malformation implied direction and permanence. This condition had neither. It was neither steadily worsening nor stabilizing. It was shifting. Some physicians resorted to metaphor in private discussions. They spoke of instability, of imbalance, of internal conflict. Such language reflected intuition more than evidence, but intuition was all that remained. The skeleton was behaving less like a structure and more like a system in flux. As time passed, enthusiasm for the rising waned. Theories that almost worked had a corrosive effect. Each failure eroded confidence, making subsequent speculation feel futile. Better to document than to guess. Better to wait for future science than to risk being wrong. And so the case entered a kind of theoretical limbo. Not abandoned, but suspended. The bones continued to change, the child continued to suffer, and medicine continued to circle the same incomplete explanations. What remained was the unsettling awareness that the problem was not a lack of effort or intelligence, but a lack of conceptual tools. The child's body was revealing processes that medicine had not yet learned to see. Not errors in nature, but gaps in knowledge. In this sense, every theory that almost worked served a purpose. Each failure outlined the boundaries of contemporary understanding. Each discarded explanation marked the edge of what science could explain at that moment in history. The skeleton, in refusing to conform, became a silent teacher. It showed that the human body was governed by layers of regulation still hidden, that bone was not merely inert support but active tissue, responsive and complex. But these lessons would not be fully understood for decades. For now, the theories remained unfinished, hovering around the case like shadows, close enough to suggest meaning, too distant to provide clarity. And as each explanation fell away, what remained was the same unsettling truth. The child's bones were doing something science could recognize, but not yet explain. The inevitable culmination of the case arrived quietly, yet with a weight that none could ignore. The child's condition had persisted for years, a slow, unrelenting series of transformations that defied explanation. Pain, unpredictability, and exhaustion had become constants, and yet the body's silent rebellion showed no mercy, no consistency, no pattern that could be confidently interpreted. Doctors continued to observe, measure, and theorize, but even their collective expertise could not forestall the progression toward a conclusion that was both inevitable and unimaginable. When the child's health deteriorated beyond the capacity for care, it was not sudden, dramatic, or violent. It was the quiet accumulation of strain over time. Bones that had once resisted weakness finally faltered. The systems governing movement and support, so mysterious, so inconsistent, began to fail in a more recognizable pattern, though still irregular enough to baffle observers. Physicians were faced with the limits of intervention, confronted by a reality that could not be manipulated, mediated, or corrected. Their authority, always provisional in the presence of disease, felt acutely fragile in the face of this ongoing anomaly. The autopsy was conducted with the care and meticulousness befitting both the child and the extraordinary circumstances. The medical team approached the procedure with an acute awareness of its significance, not only for the family but for the broader scientific community that had quietly followed the case. The child's skeleton, now freed from the constraints of living tissue, was examined in unprecedented detail. Every bone, every joint, every sign of growth or deterioration was measured, weighed, and recorded. The hope, or perhaps the fear, was that post-mortem analysis might finally provide the clarity that life had denied. What emerged from this examination was at once fascinating and profoundly disquieting. The skeletal structure revealed layers of remodeling that had gone unnoticed in life, each layer distinct yet overlapping with the last. Areas that had been reinforced during the child's life now showed signs of absorption, partial dissolution, or restructuring. Joints displayed irregular calcification patterns, suggesting localized processes of adaptation that had no known precedent. Growth plates, some prematurely closed, others astonishingly persistent, offered conflicting evidence of the child's chronological age versus skeletal maturity. The skeleton was a palimpsest, a record rewritten repeatedly, leaving traces of previous configurations beneath new ones, each change a puzzle without a key. Histological analysis provided further insight into the complexity. Bone tissue was uneven, a mixture of dense lamellar structures alongside softer, more porous material in unexpected locations. Microscopically, it appeared as though the body had alternated between reinforcing and dismantling itself, selectively altering microarchitecture with a precision that no known disease could replicate. Even when examined with the tools of modern pathology available at the time, the patterns were inexplicable. There was no consistent signature of trauma, infection, or metabolic disorder. There was only evidence of persistent, active remodeling that had operated in defiance of conventional biological rules. One of the most striking aspects of the postmortem findings was the simultaneous presence of contradictions within the same body. In certain areas, bone density suggested resilience and reinforcement, while in others, fragility and vulnerability persisted. Some structures were overdeveloped, almost exaggerated in form, while neighboring bones lagged behind, undersized and underprepared to support normal function. This juxtaposition emphasized the unevenness of the process, the idea that the skeleton had not simply failed or grown incorrectly, but had pursued multiple, conflicting trajectories at once. Physicians struggled to interpret what they saw. Was this the result of an unknown genetic mutation, altering the regulation of osteoblasts and osteoclasts in ways that defied contemporary understanding? Could it have been a novel metabolic disorder, affecting calcium deposition in unpredictable patterns? Perhaps environmental factors, exposures unrecorded or misunderstood, had triggered systemic responses that shifted over time. Each hypothesis fell short, leaving more questions than answers. The body, in death as in life, remained a confounding mystery. The autopsy also highlighted a chilling truth. Even in death, the child's body refused to conform. There were no neat resolutions, no final confirmations. Each layer of tissue, each irregularity, suggested ongoing processes that had been interrupted only by mortality, leaving the skeleton suspended in a state of incomplete transformation. What had been dynamic in life was frozen mid-change, offering a snapshot that simultaneously revealed and concealed. The patterns of remodeling could be documented, photographed, and described, but not fully understood. The mystery persisted. For the family, the autopsy was a moment of complex grief. On one level, it confirmed the finality of loss. On another, it exposed the extent of the child's suffering and the sheer incomprehensibility of the condition. Even in documentation, the child's life resisted complete representation. Physicians were careful to describe findings objectively, but there was an undercurrent of awe, frustration, and unease that permeated notes, sketches, and reports. The case transcended ordinary pathology. It had become something larger, a challenge to the very assumptions on which medicine had built its authority. Within the medical community, the autopsy findings generated cautious intrigue. Specialists who had followed the case recognized that this was not a conventional disorder. It was not simply a rare variant or an extreme expression of known pathology. It was, instead, a phenomenon that illuminated the limits of contemporary science. It suggested that the human body possessed mechanisms of change and adaptation that had not yet been conceptualized. For those who had observed the child in life, the autopsy offered both closure and frustration, finality without explanation. The case was subsequently archived, preserved as a record for future study. Histories, radiographs, and autopsy notes were meticulously catalogued, a testament to the era's commitment to observation and documentation. Yet even in preservation, the body's story resisted finality. Each plate, each measurement, each description served as a reminder that there were processes in biology that could be witnessed but not predicted, studied but not explained. It is impossible to overstate the intellectual impact of this case on the physicians who examined it. It forced them to confront uncertainty in a way that few other cases demanded. They had engaged with anomaly for years, watching a living body defy expectation, attempting interventions that sometimes helped and sometimes hindered, theorizing about possible causes, and ultimately witnessing death without understanding. The experience underscored the provisional nature of medical knowledge and the humility required when studying the living body. Even today, the case remains a point of reference for discussions about skeletal biology, pathological remodeling, and the history of medicine. It is cited in historical reviews not merely for its rarity, but for the way it demonstrates the tension between observation and understanding. The child skeleton, preserved in notes and images, serves as a symbol of what happens when the limits of science encounter the complexity of life. A body that refuses simplification, that refuses categorization, that continues to challenge long after it can no longer communicate on its own. Ultimately, the autopsy did not solve the mystery. It clarified some details, confirmed the dynamic nature of the bone changes, and provided a comprehensive record of structural anomalies. But it also deepened the sense of wonder and unease. The child's body had operated according to rules that were not yet understood, leaving physicians with data they could describe, but not fully explain. Death had ended the process, but it had not ended the questions. The child's bones, in their silent post-mortem testimony, remained a challenge to medicine, a puzzle frozen in time yet still alive in its implications.